Bom, boa noite. Bem-vindos mais uma vez ao Estúdio X. Hoje a gente vai ter a palestra do Vishaan Chakrabarti. I beg if I pronounced it wrongly. O Vishaan é diretor do programa de Real Estate, chamado CURE, da Universidade de Columbia, nos Estados Unidos, da escola, que fica dentro da Escola de Arquitetura, da qual o Estúdio X faz parte. Além disso, o Vishaan é sócio do escritório Shop Architects. Imagino que os arquitetos aqui devam conhecer, é um escritório bastante interessante, de Nova York também. E o Vishaan tem uma experiência longa no trabalho tanto no setor público quanto no setor privado. Trabalhou junto à Prefeitura de Nova York, no planejamento da cidade, enfim, tem uma pessoa com bastante experiência. E recentemente o Vishaan lançou o livro A Country of Cities, em que, enfim, ele advoca que uma das soluções para sair da crise econômica do que os Estados Unidos entraram alguns anos passados está justamente em investir em cidades. Então, ele vai apresentar esse trabalho e, enfim, suas visões sobre a cidade. Bem-vindo, Vishaan.
Bienvenue. I apologize for presenting in English, but you don't want to hear me speak in Portuguese. It would be very, very bad for your language and the relationships between our two countries. Thank you for... all okay? Can you hear? All okay? Thank you for coming tonight, and thank you, Pedro, for hosting here today. So I want to talk about this book, A Country of Cities, and the book is, for those of you who've paged through it, very much about the condition of the United States today, but I believe that condition also is having a tremendous impact on the world, in many ways a negative impact, and I think it's in some ways an issue that we all have to confront globally. And I know that your city is growing very quickly and evolving very quickly in different ways, and you have very important projects going on here, and so hopefully you'll find some relationship to some of the topics that I'll discuss tonight to some of the things that are happening here in Rio de Janeiro. I believe that one of the most basic problems that we have is the way in which we have cut up our various professions. There are those of us who consider ourselves architects and designers and landscape architects. There are some people who are urban planners who see their main job as listening to communities and consensus building in communities. There are others who see themselves in the legal profession and they write regulations and so forth. And then, of course, there's the business community, otherwise known as the capitalists, and they're often cast as kind of the bad guys in this story. But I believe that by slicing all of this, that what we've done is we've put the entire planet in danger because we're not thinking holistically and we're not working with each other enough because we're instead kind of casting each other as the enemy. And I think that has to change, and it has to change very drastically, especially given the challenge we have with climate change. And as I said, we're going to speak primarily about the United States tonight and the condition of the United States, but I believe that the condition of the United States is dramatically impacting the world. I'm going to speak very much about suburbs tonight. I know Brazil is a very urban country, and I applaud you for it. It's one of the things I love about this country. But other countries are going in a different direction. For instance, you can travel to country after country in the world today, and that you'll find that the world is getting wealthier. People are rising from poverty into middle class. But as they're doing that, many people around the world are seeking American lifestyles, and American lifestyles that include big houses and big cars. And so because of Colombia, I travel quite a bit, and almost everywhere I go, I see this. I see this amazing incursion into the landscape. I was in Saudi Arabia a few years ago, and I took a low-flying plane around Riyadh, around the capital. The capital of Saudi Arabia is growing very quickly right now. And it looked just like the desert in Arizona, in Phoenix, in the western United States, where you saw rampant suburbanization happening, suburban subdivisions, single-family houses, large cars, air conditioning, irrigated lawns. So you see the problem almost immediately when you see that there are 2 billion people approximately across the world moving into the middle class. And if they start using resources at the same rate that many middle-class Americans and Western Europeans are using resources in terms of gasoline and other fossil fuels, that we have a very significant problem for the planet. And so I call the condition of the United States today a condition of highways, houses, and hedges, a kind of synthetic landscape in which we are doing a series of things to use land, I think, in a very irresponsible way. Right now in the United States, our use of land is twice the rate of the population growth. So we're using land at a much more significant rate than we are growing as a population. And also our houses are getting larger, even though our families are getting smaller. We just, in the United States, and obviously we've felt a global recession that was really triggered in the United States. A lot of it was triggered by this condition of suburbanization and home ownership. We still have a great deal of economic distress in the United States. There are approximately 11 million Americans who are understood to be underwater. And what I mean by that is that they have so much debt that their assets are worth less than their debt. Their houses are worth less than the debt that's on their houses. And this is a very, very significant condition in the United States today and a real crisis. I believe this is directly attributable to the density at which most Americans live. So about 60% of Americans live in single-family homes. Only about 4% of Americans live at this metric of about 30 units per acre, which we don't have to get too technical about it. What it means is housing that looks like this, basically a brownstone, a townhouse, attached housing that isn't a skyscraper necessarily, but is denser than a single-family house. And the reason that that's so important is that 30 units per acre, about this kind of density, is the kind of density that you need to provide riders for mass transit. So in other words, for a light rail system or for a subway, you need enough density that you create ridership for that new mass transit system. Otherwise, that mass transit system won't be a good investment. This condition of low density in the United States really started after World War II. It started with the first big act of government in terms of the incursion into the land of the United States. In 1956, President Eisenhower passed what was known as the National Highway Defense Act. And this was done both because of the fear of a Soviet attack during the Cold War. And so the government wanted to diffuse the population outside of the cities and into the suburbs, and also to move weaponry and missile systems around the country with greater ease through this new highway system. That emphasis on highways has stayed with us today. So if you compare the national budget, the national annual expenditure, we spend much, much more on our highway system than on any other form of transportation in the United States, especially rail and mass transit, which gets very little funding from our federal government. And then if you look at the different ways in which you create energy, the oil and gas industry have much more, again, government subsidy than, for instance, solar energy or wind energy or other forms of renewable energy. And then in terms of housing, and I've only been in Rio today for about 8 or 10 hours, but in that 8 or 10 hours, all I've heard about is housing, housing, housing. And clearly, it's an extremely important topic in this city. It's an extremely important topic in every city in every country. The problem in the United States that we have is the government does invest in housing. In fact, its biggest investment that it makes, its biggest subsidy, is in housing, but it makes it in this form of something called the mortgage interest deduction, which allows people, so if you take a loan to buy a house, the government basically says, well, the interest on that loan you can deduct from your income taxes, all the way up to $1 million house. So this is an enormous expenditure of the government. By comparison, the amount of money that we spend on social housing, on public housing, on housing for the middle class, on housing for the poor, is much, much smaller than the mortgage interest deduction. Now, people believe that deduction was put in place to encourage people to buy houses in the United States. The problem is the data doesn't support that. If you look around the world, and in fact, the country with the highest home ownership in the world is Singapore, and there's absolutely no government assistance for home ownership. Because typically when people want to buy a house, they buy a house, especially if you're middle class, upper middle class, or wealthy. So the United States has the same home ownership as other countries that don't have any tax incentives to own a home. So while the data supports the fact that we shouldn't be spending that much government money to do this, what we did at the beginning of this century in 2000 with the Bush administration is we went in the opposite direction. We put even more money into home ownership. We loosened lending standards so people who maybe couldn't pay the debt on their mortgage could still get a mortgage. And this is what caused the economic collapse that we saw happen at the beginning of this century, essentially because many people were given loans that they couldn't repay. Those loans were bundled and securitized, and you had the global economic collapse. In fact, in the United States, what you saw is that between 2000 and 2010, housing debt reached almost 80% of the GDP of the United States. 80% of the gross economic output of the country, right, was measured in terms of housing debt, and the vast majority of that was for single-family houses, meaning single-family homes, as opposed to this green is multifamily housing. Most of the kind of housing that uses the mortgage interest deduction is, in fact, single-family houses. Now, many people, I'm just curious, how many of you have heard about this idea called the American Dream? Most of you? Everyone, right? And when you think about the American Dream, what do you think that is? Buying a house and a car. Is that, well, I want to get to that last part. So she just said buying a house, buying a car, paying for college for your children. I want to get to that last piece about college. But how many of you think that when you think of the American Dream that it's about buying a house and a car? Most of you? Okay. I don't think that's the American Dream. I think that's the American scheme. And it's built around a consumer economy. It's about making Americans consumers because that's what keeps the American economy afloat, right? So no matter where you come from, we subsidize oil production, we subsidize debt on housing and cars, we live in suburbs, we don't walk enough, we get fatter, and then we find ourselves in a lot of economic distress as a country. To me, this is the American dream. The American dream is a dream of opportunity. And it actually has, in my mind, and I've looked up actually some historical evidence that supports this, when the idea of the American dream first came up, it had nothing to do necessarily with a house and a car and a patch of grass. It really was very much about opportunity. And this dream in the United States of a classless society, that anyone could come from anywhere, and through hard work you could get your kid into college, right? Although now there's a lot of trouble around student loan debt, but you could get your kid into college and that your child would grow up and be successful. And that was actually the core and the original thinking of the American dream, that over time, that prosperity would grow. And so I believe that cities are at a key moment in American history and a key moment in world history in terms of understanding how to get ourselves out of the very problematic situation that we've created for ourselves in the United States and now increasingly around the world. Now, the United Nations asks us to measure society through what they call the 3 E's: the economy, the environment, and equity, social equity. And they've said, you know, those are some of the 3 guideposts. And so what I'll try to do is go through those in some detail. So first, in terms of the economy, or what I like to call prosperity and its relationship to globalization. So I'm sure all of you have heard of Jane Jacobs, and most of you probably know Jane Jacobs as a grassroots activist, a community fighter, someone who fought power. But she was actually very focused on her own economic vision for the world, and a focus on the idea that cities are the lifeblood of a nation's economy, that cities are the fountainhead of a nation's economy. And she had this idea called import replacements, which is basically that if you had a small city, it needed to bring in goods and services. It had to pay for those goods and services. Over time, people in that city would learn how to create those goods and services themselves, right? And so they would replace those imports internally. Then over time, the city would grow, and as it grew, it could actually export those goods and services and become an export economy and bring in money from other places because it became an export economy. If you look at the technology sector today, this is precisely what's happened. The technology sector that started in Silicon Valley has now spread across the world in a form of import replacement that's now spreading to Africa and the Philippines and other places around the world. And this helps to explain why Jane Jacobs was so right. My team did some research and found, and I find this extraordinary, that 90% of the economic output of the United States and 86% of the jobs of the United States are generated on 3% of its landmass. So a very, very small concentration of the land of the United States generates the vast majority of wealth and the vast majority of jobs that the United States creates. And this is not a coincidence. It completely is pinpointed on our most productive cities and the regions around them. I used to work for the Bloomberg administration for the municipality in New York City, and we worked for a deputy mayor named Dan Doctoroff, and he had a theory similar to Jane Jacobs called the virtuous cycle of the successful city. And what he believed that every city should do around the world is that our main goal was to attract new residents. That in the world we live in today, that the most important thing is how do you attract new human capital, new intelligence that comes and innovates and does creative things in your city. And he believed that in order to do that, what a city needed to do is, as new residents came and paid tax dollars to the city, that the city should take those tax dollars and invest them in quality of life, in mass transit, in parks, in schools, in healthcare. And what that would do in turn is it would attract more new residents in a cycle of growth. And so that the more people came, the more the city could wisely invest the economic output of those people into new quality of life. And it's interesting when you look at this, and you look at it worldwide, this is precisely what happens. Cities are the generators of wealth in virtually every country in the world. What happens in the United States, however, is that cities generate wealth, and then they actually end up having to subsidize all the suburban regions around them. And you see this great expanse of a city like Los Angeles. You compare that to a city like Hong Kong, and what you find out about a place like Hong Kong is it generates a tremendous amount of wealth, it generates a tremendous amount of tax dollars, but then it's able to reinvest those tax dollars directly into Hong Kong. So for instance, New York City last year paid $16 billion to the federal government, to Washington, D.C., in tax returns that it never got back in federal investment, right? Because that money gets distributed all over the United States. And so as a consequence, this is why when you fly to New York, right, you fly into an airport that looks like some horror movie, right? And why you can't take a train from the airport into the center of the city like you can in London, or you can in Hong Kong, or you can in Singapore, right? Pardon me?
Actually, you can.
Oh, it's terrible.
I did it once.
Yeah, you're a brave soul. So that's the economic piece for a moment. Sustainability. Americans have this strange idea that being green is about seeing green. And these are two very different thoughts. This is Henry David Thoreau, a great American thinker, and really celebrated this idea of a life in isolation in nature. And people have somehow confused this with sustainability. This is not at all sustainability. And this is why. Because in terms of the Earth, we have a finite set of resources. We have a finite set of how much energy we have, clean water we have, and so forth. Right now, if you look at the rate at which we're using resources, we're using about a third more resources than the planet has. If everyone on the planet used resources the way Americans use resources, we would be using resources at 5.5 times the rate of what the planet has. And if you understand what a dramatic situation this is the work of Bill McKibben, who's written about the fact that if you just look at the oil and gas that's underneath the Earth's crust, if you just use roughly about 20% of that, so forget about finding new oil or new gas in any places. If you just use 20% of the existing resources, oil resources and gas resources, right, it will raise the Earth's temperature about 2 degrees Celsius, right, which many climate scientists believe is the threshold at which we will have catastrophic climate change. This is a coastal city. I'm from a coastal city. We all understand what this means for our cities, and I'll get to this at the end. But to understand the source of that is you have to look at how people use land. And what's clear is the more people spread out into the suburbs, the more their carbon emissions per person is increased. So by the time you get down to urban living, what you find out is that the carbon we use is much lower in a city like New York. And in fact, the average New Yorker uses about a third less energy per person than the average person who lives out in the woods somewhere and can see trees. Now, so and I'm an architect and I practice, and there's a lot of conversation about green buildings, and I'm sure there's a lot of conversations about green buildings here. I find this a particularly fascinating idea because right now what you have is, in the United States, and I'd be curious to understand if this is a phenomenon here, people have these big houses and big cars, and there's this idea that technology is going to save the situation, that if you put solar panels and windmills and electric cars, which are a complete lie. In the United States, if you have an electric car, all you're doing is you're changing emissions from gasoline to a coal-powered power plant. So you're actually making the planet worse. You just feel better about yourself. So this idea that technology makes this change doesn't. What makes the change are people living in relatively small apartments and riding mass transit. That's what makes the big change. Now, if you then add technology to that structure, you can then get very important increases in terms of sustainability. And that's not just true at the scale of big cities like Rio or New York or Tokyo. This is a picture I took flying out of Tokyo. This is a typical Japanese farming village. So in Japan, the way people typically farm is all the farmers live in a cluster, and they farm the fields outside. They don't locate their house out on the piece of property that they own. So if you think about that, there's one main sewage line, there's one main water line, there's one main power line. It's not spreading that infrastructure across a vast landscape as we do in the United States. So sustainability and density are tied together in a very, very dramatic way. And in fact, it's interesting because all of us feel that we have a population problem on the planet. And we passed 7 billion people, I think, a couple of years ago. But what's interesting is, if we lived at this density, at about that 30 units per acre, all 7 billion of us could fit in the state of Texas. I'm not suggesting we all move to Texas. For those of you who know Texas, many of you will not want to move to Texas. But I'm just trying to make a point that, even if, I have a colleague, Jeff Sachs, who's done brilliant work about the Millennium Development Goals and how to bring down the birth rate in third world countries and so forth, and all of that's very important. But no matter how you look at it, we're probably going to have 10 billion people on this planet at the end of 2100. A lot of those people are going to be middle class, and they're going to want to live nice lives, right? And so the question is, if you accept that fact, then the key to me is how do you set up people's lives to be joyous inside of cities, as opposed to living in this spread out way? So one of the key messages of the book is that if you really love nature, don't live in it. And so instead of this fantasy of the single-family house and all of this technology that's going to save us, I believe that the landscape around the world should look much more like this: a dense landscape connected largely by trains, with lots of undeveloped land around it. Now, what many people will say is, but to live in that kind of density and skyscrapers and so forth, is that healthy? Does it bring public joy? And this isn't just about what the right engineering solution is. We should think about how to bring ourselves joy. Architects have, through the course, and planners as well, through the course of the 18th century, 19th, 20th century, faced with the industrial city, had all sorts of plans for how to tame the city and how to make it a more healthy, more joyous place. What's interesting, though, is it was none of those plans that changed the way we think about cities, especially in the United States. Cities in the United States in the 1970s had extraordinarily high crime rates. Today, most cities have seen an enormous drop in crime. New York is the safest big city in America and is safer than many suburban regions across the United States. In fact, some of the most dangerous parts of New York have the same population and a dramatically lower murder rate than the entirety of the city of Dallas, for instance. And so we brought crime down, and that's a true health and joy issue. And then there's this very serious medical issues associated with suburban living and low-density living. And what you find is that the more outside of cities you live, the more there are problems of obesity, of people not walking, of people driving everywhere, and that leads to a series of chronic health care conditions that are a real problem. And then there are auto accidents. So the number one cause of infant mortality in the world is not malaria, it's not AIDS, it's vehicular accidents. That's the number one cause of children's deaths around the world. In the United States today, about a third of our auto accidents have to do with texting while driving. You know, you're driving on one end and you're doing this, right? That is what's causing a huge number of our accidents today. And I'm sure this is a problem here as well. And you ask yourself, well, why is that a problem? Why are people engaged in this activity? People are engaged in this activity because they're bored in their cars. They're in traffic jams. They want to be productive. They want to be entertained. And so they look to their device. And then there's romance. And it turns out that the longer your commute is, this is a Swedish study that showed that the longer your commute is, the higher your probability of divorce. Because not only of the time lost to commuting, but actually the stress associated with commuting. And then in the United States, and I'd be interested to hear from the audience whether you think this is true in other parts of the world, but in the United States you had a dramatic change in the 90s in terms of how cities were depicted. So cities through the 1970s in television and movies were depicted as these fairly terrible places, crime shows, right? Lots of socially unacceptable behavior. And then suddenly in the 90s, there's this complete transformation of how a city like New York is depicted, where people, young people, largely young white people that didn't have very busy jobs, right, were coming to the city and having lots of fun. And suddenly, you know, today in New York City, there are 47 million tourists annually, which has been enormous for the economy of New York City. And I think much of it is suddenly this change in the depiction of the city, both nationally and internationally. And this has really changed the way young people are dealing with cities, not just in New York, but all across the United States. So we have what we call the millennial generation, which are the people who were born in the 80s and the 90s. In the U.S., that's about 80 million people. It's the largest demographic segment that we have in the population. And these are people that are showing a complete resistance to moving to the suburbs, even after they have children. They're not buying cars, which has the car companies scared to death. And when they leave a city like New York or San Francisco because it's too expensive, they're moving to Baltimore or they're moving to Detroit or they're not moving to the suburbs. They're moving to other cities. And survey after survey shows young people dreaming about living in the city. And of course, cities are responding. And this goes back to, I talked about Dan Doctoroff earlier, that whole theory of the virtuous cycle of the successful city. Whether you look at Chicago or St. Louis or Dallas, cities around the United States are building extraordinary parks, new transit systems, all in this race to compete for these young people, right, which bring economic activity and innovation. New architecture, this is Rem Koolhaas or Norman Foster or Tom Main. Again, city after city bringing in innovative architecture to change the way the city looks and feels. In our own city, my firm has done a lot of work on the waterfront, and again, urban waterfronts are changing dramatically all around the United States. And so you have this condition of the way the United States was structured from after World War II, of driving from a single-family house to an office park, drinking and driving, people screaming at each other and so forth, as opposed to this idea of taking light rail, having a glass of wine before you get on it and not having to worry about it, meeting people on it, and most importantly, in a service economy, saving time. And so part of what the book tries to present is kind of a utopian vision for what a good city could be. We don't have this city in the United States. Most places don't have this city. It's an ideal about this place where one could walk, one could take mass transit, one didn't have to drive very much, where there was culture in the arts, parks, and most importantly, I think, affordable housing, which we'll get to towards the end. So the second section is really about how one builds these cities that I'm talking about. And one, I believe, has to start with this idea of hyperdensity, and I'll define what that term means, and density that creates civic delight. A lot of time when architects and planners talk about density, they say, well, yes, of course density is good, but we like density in the way, old European cities built density. It's true, Paris is a very dense place. It's about 80 units per acre. It's quite dense. And it's beautiful. My wife and I got engaged in Paris. It's a lovely city. It's also one of the most socially segregated places on the planet, with massive suburban discontent and poverty, and a huge disassociation between the wealthy people who live in the center city and those who live outside of it. And with extraordinary density caps, Paris, in inner city Paris, is not allowed to grow. There's no structure for affordable housing. There's no structure for immigration, which is a very contentious issue in Paris, right? And so I don't think this represents a model for the future. And so I think we, again, have to look at these different forms of density, and different cities will adopt. New York City and Manhattan's very comfortable with these kinds of densities. Tokyo, Hong Kong, other parts of the world will be very comfortable with this density. I think it's all fine because all of it supports people moving around by mass transit. And so creating more density around nodes of transportation. And so this is a picture of Dallas, and Dallas actually has done a number of things, and they've built some mass transit and so forth. But because there are so many parking lots and so forth in most American cities, there's room to build on the already developed land of much of what constitutes most American cities. Again, I think design is critical to this because I don't think people will ever believe that living in a hyperdense environment will be a joyous thing unless there's beautiful architecture associated with it. I also think historic preservation is absolutely essential, but I actually think historic preservation can work very well with new density by adding new buildings, and we have situations like this in New York that help to support and preserve heritage sites. I'm sure many of you have heard about the High Line. When I worked at the City of New York, I was very involved with this, not just in terms of the planning of the new park, which is this old railway that was converted into this promenade, but the air rights transfer mechanism that was designed around it. So basically, people wanted to tear the High Line down. We allowed an air rights transfer mechanism in new residential development that allowed people who own land underneath the High Line to sell their air rights to adjacent properties. And so that's resulted in some of the most extraordinary new architecture in the city around the High Line Park. And I think it's resulted in something that I like to call the sort of high-low city, or the unpredictable city. And I think London is a very good example of this, where it isn't about all the buildings being a uniform height, but where you walk around and you're constantly met by surprises. And it's visually stimulating to be in this place that has old and new, and has figured out a way to bring new buildings into the heart of the city. And at least in the United States, and again, I don't know if this is true here in Brazil, our planners are much too regimented in the way they think. They think that all the short buildings have to be next to each other, all the medium-sized buildings have to be next to each other, and all the tall buildings need to be next to each other. Now, I'm 2 meters tall. My wife's a good foot taller, shorter than me. We get along just fine. This idea that everyone and everything that's the same height has to be together, I think, doesn't make for a very interesting or unpredictable place. And so one of the things we're talking about in New York are air rights controls that are much more fluid, where you can increase density in an existing neighborhood, but then allow those air rights to land in all sorts of different ways and places. So as you walked around that city, you could see a 7-story building where they didn't want to redevelop, but they could sell their air rights to another building that was trying to redevelop at a very different scale. In Brooklyn, we're starting to see some of this. This is the new arena that we've done and some of the first modular housing that I'll talk about in a little bit. But again, it's that variation of heights and scales that I think is so important and very interesting and dynamic. And again, this idea of civic delight. This is the open space in front of the arena. And this was a former rail yard. It was basically a hole in the ground. And before a concert or a basketball game, it's just electric there. It's an extraordinary experience to be there. There's a subway line, so 11 subways come right here. So this is a sports arena with 20,000 seats, and it has no parking. None whatsoever. And also some of the new housing that's going to be built around it with shops and so forth. And so I want to stress that I'm not just talking about density for density's sake. In other words, I don't believe that big buildings by themselves have all that much merit. If you go to Dubai, this is exactly what you find. You find the tallest building in the world, no mass transit to speak of, and land all around it, which defies any kind of real estate logic, actually. And so it's not about kind of mindless, auto-oriented density, but really about density that centers on this kind of sense of infrastructure. And by infrastructure, I don't just mean, in the United States we have a fairly traditional definition of infrastructure, which is systems that move people, move goods, move sewage and water and electricity. But I mean a wider definition that includes the infrastructure of opportunity, which includes schools and parks and healthcare and affordable housing, social housing, that actually creates social mobility. We used to build a lot of infrastructure in the United States. After World War II, we dropped in our infrastructure investment in real dollar terms about $2.2 trillion that we have not invested. Where you really see this is in our rail system. You see China now with an extraordinary amount of high-speed rail. You see the United States with almost none. What's interesting about that is the continental United States and China are roughly the same size. And this is the Mid-Atlantic corridor, one of the busiest air corridors in the United States, from Atlanta up to New York City. If we had the same high-speed trains that China has, we could run that entire corridor in about 3 hours, as opposed to the 4 hours it takes to fly, the very long time it takes to drive. And what this means, And I put a challenge to you in terms of Sao Paulo to Rio, because I took a flight to Sao Paulo this morning and then took this ridiculous airplane to Rio. This is not the way industrialized countries live, right? In Japan, of course, they built their high-speed rail connecting Tokyo and Kyoto the year I was born, which, trust me, was a long time ago. And it now runs every 6 minutes, and it's an extraordinary service. So, at least in the U.S., we have no way to fund these things. This is the area where New York's train station is, sitting underneath another sports arena. This is this whole area near the port that is going under redevelopment. And what we did when I worked for the city is we upzoned this area for many more air rights. We used something called tax increment financing, meaning we basically issued government debt to pay for a subway extension and 20 acres of new parkland that would be paid through the future tax revenue of the development that's going to occur here. This subway line is under construction. It'll be built in 2017. But still, this is rather sad. This is 2 kilometers of subway line. It took 4 million square meters of new development, 4 million square meters planning of new development to pay for 2 kilometers of subway line. Shanghai is building 196 kilometers of subway line by 2020. So it's extraordinary what's happening around the world by comparison. At SHOP, we were also asked to look at Penn Station, and this was a design competition. I'm going to go through it very quickly. But basically, we looked at this whole new district, looked at the new real estate value that could be generated by the creation of a new train station and new parks, created this whole density diagram for where density could go, and put forward an idea for a new train station that was not only beautiful, but that could pay for itself because of the value that it would add to the real estate around it. Okay, this is the last section. Social housing. And I'm very interested to have this conversation with you afterwards. In the United States, we used to have a very significant form of building new public housing, and much of it was very successful, right? And sometimes history has been changed a little bit to convince you that this wasn't successful. But in fact, there are many successful examples of it. This, designed by Mies van der Rohe in Detroit, called Lafayette Park, one of the more successful examples of public housing. What we have today is a condition where a city like New York, with its competitor cities like Tokyo and London, very, very expensive city to live in. And what's happened is that in terms of the way we define affordable housing, is that about 30% of your income should be going to your housing costs, right? And 70% needs to go to everything else, right? Because you have other expenses in life. In the US since 1960, we've had a 40% loss of housing that is affordable to most Americans, by that definition of 30%. So all through most of the 20th century, we built public housing, social housing that looked like this. It was government financed, it had problems with it, but it also was a commitment by the government to build housing for the poorest people in the country. That went away under Ronald Reagan. There was a change to the tax code, and what we do now, which has some benefits, is we build what's known as mixed income housing. And I've lectured about this in other parts of the world, and I find there's a very interesting response. So what this is housing for rent. Most of it, usually 80%, sometimes 50%, is rented to market rate tenants, meaning people who are paying very expensive rents. And the remainder is actually available to people who make below 60% of the mean income in the country. So people who are quite low income. And they live in the same building. And this has been a very successful program in the United States, and especially in New York, and has a major advantage if you're low income. Because if you're low income, you're not trapped in a low income environment. You're in a mixed income environment. And so when you send your children to school, you're sending your children to a school that's mixed income. And that means that they have an opportunity for social mobility that's much more difficult in a place that's completely for poor people. I'm probably a bit over time, so I'm going to go a little bit quickly. We're okay? Housing has three components to its cost: the cost of construction, the cost of the land, and the cost of the financing. The cost of the land is almost completely about the density that the government allows you to put on it. The more density, it means the more you can spread that cost over more units. Reason density is good. In terms of the cost of construction, we've started looking at modular housing, which is housing in which there's a steel frame built, then housing units, prefabricated units, are built in a factory and brought by truck and constructed like Lego blocks into that steel frame. And that we believe, will lower construction costs by approximately 20% and could be a major driver for new urban affordable housing in the United States. And then the cost of financing. I spoke to you earlier about this mortgage interest deduction and how we spend about $100 billion on it. People that are both Republicans and Democrats believe that the mortgage interest deduction is bad policy. And even the Congressional Budget Office, one of the independent entities in Washington, has looked at how we could bring the mortgage interest deduction down $100,000 a year and recapture about $517 billion of government expenditure. And I believe a significant portion of that should be going to low and middle income housing for cities in the United States to build much greater density and a much more significant mixed use kind of projects. And again, this is one of the projects that we're doing in Brooklyn that is what's known as 50-30-20. So 50% market rate, 30% middle income, 20% low income. And this will be built modularly. Pardon me? Private developer, but with government subsidies on the low-income pieces. But it's not just about low-income housing. Also, it's about low-income, or not low-income, or lower-priced workspace and office space to create more incubators and innovation. One of the things that's interesting about New York is New York used to be what's known as a hub-and-spoke city. Everyone would come into one place, work, and then go home at the end of the night. You look at New York today, and inside of the city, it's a network of hubs, right? So our office, for instance, is in Lower Manhattan. We're never in Midtown Manhattan. There are other people who work in Brooklyn and live in Brooklyn and never even go to Manhattan. And this is an entirely different phenomena in New York City today in terms of how people are working. We're working on two projects where this is in the Lower East Side. This is in Brooklyn. I'm about to show you that project, neither of which 10 years ago you would ever think to locate office space. Unthinkable. And where we're building major amounts of office space, as well as this is the Domino site in Brooklyn, an old sugar refinery. This is an old industrial waterfront, about a quarter mile of new open space, about 3 million square feet of development. One of the things we've looked very carefully at is how these buildings meet the street in a very New York kind of way. One of the things that the developer has committed to is no national chain stores, so no Starbucks, it's all independent neighborhood retail. We think that's very important for the feel of the project. A new public school, as well as a community center. This is an existing refinery that's being turned into a technology hub for technology companies. Major new open space out in front of that. And again, 50-30-20 affordable housing, mixed income housing. Some very innovative architecture. This was a very controversial project in that it's a much larger scale than the neighborhood around it. One of the things we tried to do is design a kind of porous architecture that would bring light and air through to the neighborhood. This is going through public approvals right now, and I think we're going to get it done. So that's just an example of, I think, the kind of cities we could be building. This is a famous painting that shows the fall of Rome. And I like to remind my friends in the United States that empires fall. This is the end of the third season of the television show Weeds that shows a suburban subdivision burning to the ground. And actually, it's very sad. We have wildfires all across the western United States that are being caused by this incursion into the landscape. Again, it's a very sad condition. So this is the country we have today. We have a major economic problem. We have major environmental problems. We have major social mobility problems. And by that I mean that most people in America, their wages have frozen for the last 2 decades in real dollar terms. This is the country I believe we could have, one that's much more dense, connected largely by rail, and in which there's much more environmental, social, and economic health. And so what it is to take all those subsidies I talked about, use some of them towards the deficit, some of them towards what I call the American Smart Infrastructure Act, or ASIA for short, with the idea that we would take a lot of that money, invest it in urban infrastructure, urban schools, urban affordable housing, urban parks, and that in turn would create more economic productivity and turn our deficit into a surplus. But also, more importantly, do the things that the 3 things that the United Nations asks of us, which is to create a prosperous country, to create an environmentally sustainable country, and to create a more socially equitable country. That's a landscape that would go from a place like Denver, which is a big, sprawling city today, to something that's much more compact and more vertical and based on mass transit. These kinds of transformations, after 9/11, we transformed Lower Manhattan through government policy in the course of 10 years. It's a completely different place today. People live there, they work there, it's a wonderful place to be. And so I point to that because I'm just trying to say that through the right policies, you can change countries very quickly. The suburban landscape we have in the United States was really built over the course of about 50 years. And so this, to me, is like smoking. You know, you smoke, and when you quit smoking, your lungs take some years to clear out. And I think if we were to change the way our policies work over the course of some decades, we would change the way in which we live. The last thing I'll just talk about is climate change, because cities, when you create this kind of density, have vulnerabilities. And this is some of the work my students did at CURE, where they estimated all this land that comes out of New York Harbor and said, what if you use that land in a productive way and connected Manhattan with this new neighborhood to a place called Governor's Island, which is an island that sits outside, called Lower Manhattan, or LOLO. And with the LOLO proposal, and this is what I mean about the disciplines coming together, these were architecture and urban design and real estate students working together. They basically believe that that new area, that extension of Manhattan, would cost about $10 billion to build and would generate about $20 billion in new economic value, including a string of new barrier islands that would protect Lower Manhattan during hurricanes. And what's so interesting is they did this before Hurricanes Irene and Sandy hit, so they were actually way before the storm. I know you're doing a lot of development in your port area and so forth. One of the things that was great about what these students did is they actually designed the whole system to flood. So they designed it so that the infrastructure could flood, the streets could flood, the buildings could flood, and that they would still be resilient. My last slide, and this is where I think the academy can be very important, and places like Studio X and the research we do here can be so important, is that proposal that my students did ended up causing the city to do a scaled-back version of the same idea, and they put out an RFP, a request for proposals, for something called Seaport City, which was new development on the waterfront that was transit-based, that had affordable housing in it, that also could form climate resilience and flood control for the city of New York. So I do believe that this kind of academic work we do can really impact people's lives and impact policy and impact the way in which we all live together. And so these are the conditions of the U.S. I apologize if I've spoken about the United States too much tonight, but I do believe that it's dramatically impacting the way the rest of the world is developing. I know that here you have troubles beyond suburbs, you have other sets of issues, that this is a very urban country and there are other issues. And I think we're going to have some respondents talk about that. So thank you very much for your attention. I appreciate it very much. Thank you for the invitation.
Tá dando para ouvir bem com esse barulheiro aí fora? Tá, ok. You have a party outside. No, so... Ok, então agora a gente vai ter uma conversa com o Vishaan. Eu queria convidar o Washington Fajardo e o João Pedro Backhäuser. O Washington Fajardo é diretor do Instituto Rio Patrimônio da Humanidade e assessor para assuntos urbanos da Prefeitura da cidade. E o João Pedro Backhäuser é arquiteto, atualmente é um dos responsáveis do projeto da Vila de Mídia e Árbitros no Porto do Rio, desenvolveu o projeto alternativo do Pier, alternativo ao Pier em Y, do Porto também. E, enfim, vamos sentar aqui, eles vão conversar um pouco, depois a gente abre para as perguntas de todos.
Qual é a mecânica que você quer fazer? Conversar? Não, vocês fazem como pergunta. Bom. Então eu vou começar. Eu vou falar em português porque eu consigo parecer mais inteligente em português. Eu estava... Semana passada eu assisti Playtime, do Jacques Tati. E eu queria, então, começar perguntando, te provocando, porque quando, de uma certa maneira, ao ler o livro e a ver a sua apresentação, a gente relembra esses momentos onde, na história do urbanismo, a visão sobre as cidades era uma visão extremamente otimista, baseada na ciência, na tecnologia, a ideia da cidade funcionalista. Eu costumo me perguntar e me questionar, eu acredito que a crise energética dos anos 70 e o advento das questões ambientais e da própria sustentabilidade tem embutidas dentro das suas propostas também um certo ambiente, uma certa visão também otimista, em alguns momentos uma certa visão naif sobre a possibilidade de futuro para as cidades. Então, essa é uma provocação. Como então como lidar com a cidade como lidar com a cidade que existe e com a cidade com as cidades que terão um papel fundamental no planeta e no futuro do planeta e nesse futuro as cidades as metrópoles de larga escala, de alta complexidade funcional, com profundas demandas habitacionais, de mobilidade, inclusive de sustentabilidade, serão as cidades de maior concentração populacional. Quando a gente olha para a apresentação, para a administração Bloomberg, a gente reconhece, de fato, experiências muito bem sucedidas nessa capacidade de realizar o manejo da cidade que existe. Entretanto, uma cidade conseguiu alcançar um certo platô de desenvolvimento urbano e social. Entretanto, por outro lado, a administração e o período Bloomberg também é muito questionado pelo crescimento da desigualdade na cidade. Então, falando então por uma perspectiva dessa visão otimista para o futuro e olhando para as realidades das grandes e complexas cidades latino-americanas, do Sudeste Asiático, da África, que visão você tem olhando para um planeta de cidades?
Hello? it's an excellent question, and I think you're absolutely right. That I think you're absolutely right that one can't be too utopian about these things, or naive. Although I think it's always important to be a little naive, because otherwise you can't get out of bed in the morning. But cities, and the large cities that we're talking about, and not just, as you say, not just in the U.S., but a planet of cities, could be a disaster on all these fronts. They could be an economic disaster, an environmental disaster, and especially a disaster in terms of social equity. Cities are large heat islands, and so environmentally, with the wrong policies, you can see cities concentrating a huge amount of pollution and congestion. You can see inequity in cities, although the thing about inequity in cities that you have to understand is big successful cities, I will argue, will always have certain levels of inequity. Why? Because take a city like Mumbai. Mumbai has 2,000 people moving a day from villages into central Mumbai. Why? Those are intelligent people. What they're doing is they're moving from villages into the city because they believe that they can create a better livelihood for themselves and send money back home to their families and so forth. And so when that poor person moves into it, I mean, there are condos in Mumbai that are more expensive than condos in New York, easily. So when that poor person moves into Mumbai, the inequity level grows. So I don't think it's actually fair to judge cities on inequity. I think what you have to judge them on is social mobility, which is once that poor person moves to the city, what happens then? Does that person have an opportunity to find housing that he or she can afford? Can they send their child to a decent school? Can they get decent health care? Can they find some open space to go play a game of football? Those, to me, are the critical issues. Similarly, with the environment, have we built bike lanes? Have we built a mass transit system? I think there's a famous mayor from Bogota who said a developed country isn't a country where poor people have cars. It's a country where rich people take mass transit, right? And so, to me, cities aren't just by virtue of being themselves the solution. It is very much about the right set of policies in terms of social equity, in terms of housing for low-income people, and creating mixed-income environments. It's about having the right kind of environmental policies. And then I was trying to talk about this technology office spaces and so forth, creating a wide range of places where people can work and innovate so that the economy grows and there's shared prosperity. Those things aren't givens. They can only come if there's the right policies in place.
Alô, boa noite. Vishaan, recebi o livro, pude ver o livro semana passada. E primeiro dizer que é muito interessante o trabalho. Assim, eu gosto de livro. Tive um professor até na Colômbia, falava assim, você vai pegar um livro de arquitetura ou de urbanismo, primeira coisa você folheia para ver se tem bastante diagrama, porque aí é sinal que, né? E o livro eu acho que isso sintetiza, é uma maneira que você consegue transformar visualmente, né, temas às vezes complexos, às vezes, e você acha uma maneira muito inteligente de sintetizar e demonstrar isso dessa maneira diagramática que faz as coisas ficarem bem claras, né? Eu acho que quando passei o olho, hoje mesmo de manhã encontrei com o Washington, né, rapidamente, por conta do lançamento até do projeto nosso lá no Porto, e aí estava conversando com o Washington, tudo bem, mas por que nós, né, que estamos estudando a cidade, desenhando, projetando, por que nós acreditamos na cidade, né, por que nós entendemos que a cidade né, o lugar do futuro, mas por que as pessoas que estão aqui fora, do outro lado, ainda sonham em morar fora da cidade, né? Porque esse é um pouco talvez esse dilema, quer dizer, quem estuda, quem trabalha, quem pratica, acredita, compreende, quer fazer, e de repente quem está vivendo a vida do dia a dia continua sonhando com aquela casa, né? Tinha uma música aqui no Brasil, eu quero uma casa no campo, né? Que é quase aquela história. Eu acho que na tua apresentação tem um momento, que até me lembrei também, que acho que mostra o Seinfeld, é o Seinfeld aquele primeiro, o do meio eu não consegui identificar, Friends eu já não conheço, e Sex and the City. E eu morei em Nova York, na esquina do diner do Seinfeld, e vinha ônibus de turismo, todo mundo saltava para ver aquilo, tirava foto, era uma coisa inacreditável. Mas eu acho que é um pouco, que ali talvez esteja foi um pouco essa resposta para a minha pergunta. Na verdade, não tem muita pergunta a fazer, colocando. Que talvez a cidade tenha sido, vamos dizer assim, vendida pela própria cidade, ou imaginada, no caso, vamos supor, Rio e São Paulo, as pessoas vinham para a cidade por conta das oportunidades que a cidade oferecia, praticamente financeiras, né? E assim, óbvio, uma oportunidade de uma melhor escola e tal, mas nunca era o lugar onde se morava, mas talvez não onde se desejasse morar, enquanto aqueles outros pontos que a cidade pode e deve oferecer, que é o lazer, é a cultura, é o ócio, né? E, de repente, tem um momento, começa a ter esse momento que aconteceu em Nova York, dessa transição. A cidade começa a entender que ela é mais do que apenas um local de oportunidade de crescimento, né, financeiro e de oportunidade de estudo, mas também um espaço que oferece, né? E talvez seja isso. Quer dizer, eu acho que é um momento de transição da imagem, né, e da ideia de cidade, né? E é um momento de transição também de entendimento, e aí o teu primeiro slide leva talvez ao teu último capítulo, da reinvenção de como fazer essa cidade, né? Do entendimento que essa cidade não pode ser feita isolada em partes, e nem com mecanismos tradicionais, que eventualmente ainda persistem, mas que devem ser repensados. Então, buscar novas maneiras de financiamento, novas estruturas espaciais, né? Novas parcerias entre diferentes órgãos. Então, eu acho que o que a gente tem que refletir, que a gente tem que estar pensando e buscando, são essas inovações, né? Entender essas novas possibilidades de pensamento, de planejamento e de execução, né, dessa cidade, que não é a cidade apenas de oferecer oportunidade, mas oferecer oportunidade também de vida, né, de vida que vai além, como você disse, você conheceu sua mulher em Paris e tal, maravilhoso, mas existe um subúrbio diferente, que essa história de subúrbio é engraçado também, quer dizer, 15 anos se fala de subúrbio, Estados Unidos, quando a gente chega aqui no Rio, subúrbio é outra coisa, né, quer dizer, subúrbio dessas casas lindas, com um jardim maravilhoso, e ruas. Quando você vai para o nosso subúrbio, a situação é a inversa, né? O subúrbio aqui é a falta de, né? A falta de infraestrutura, a falta de acesso, a falta de, né? Então, também entender esses diferentes subúrbios aí, né? Através do mundo. Então, na verdade, é uma reflexão, não tem pergunta nenhuma, né? Mas talvez colocar...
Eu queria dar um panorama para vocês sobre a região central do Rio, essa área que nós estamos, e falar um pouco, a gente possa falar um pouco sobre estratégias de adensamento em contextos históricos. Essa região que a gente está, que é a Praça Tiradentes, ela faz parte de uma área, uma área protegida, que é um distrito histórico de preservação, chamado Corredor Cultural. E isso é uma preservação que foi criada no início dos anos 80, e esse tipo de instrumento urbanístico desde então, vem sendo bastante utilizado na cidade. Hoje nós temos mais de 35 mil imóveis preservados, e no caso da região central, se excluirmos a área do aeroporto e a área da Ilha das Cobras, que é uma área militar da Marinha, 85% a 90% do território urbanizável da região central é preservado pelo patrimônio. Entretanto, esse território ele tem uma densidade construída muito baixa. O tecido urbano preservado ele é essencialmente dessa tipologia que nós estamos. térreo mais 4 pavimentos. Então, nós temos uma densidade construída baixa e, além disso, tínhamos uma legislação que perdurou durante quase 40 anos, que impedia o licenciamento habitacional na região central, fruto de uma visão funcionalista do centro do Rio exclusivamente como local de trabalho. Então, essa é uma segunda camada de complexidade. E, além disso, o próprio esparramamento urbano da cidade, urban sprawl da cidade, também levando a cidade para a zona oeste e outras áreas da cidade. Isso resultou no contexto que a gente tem hoje, que é um centro que é a menor densidade demográfica da cidade. Entretanto, mesmo incrementando esforços de adensamento, você tem um limite de adensamento que é a própria tipologia construída. Por outro lado, nós temos uma paisagem bastante híbrida, bastante americana ou latino-americana. Nós temos edifícios em altura, muito mais altos do que essa tipologia do século XIX, fruto de diferentes legislações. Então, eu entendo que temos uma paisagem construída bastante dinâmica e urbanisticamente bastante provocadora. Isso me interessou muito na leitura do seu livro, quando você mostra exatamente uma visão que é comum dos planejadores urbanos públicos que entendem uma cidade sempre por caixas, né? E, de fato, a cidade pode produzir paisagens construídas muito mais dinâmicas. Entretanto, temos que é quase um consenso social e cultural no Rio de Janeiro, onde a população entende edifícios em altura como algo, não estou falando de arranha-céus, mas edifícios altos como problemáticos para a cidade. E aí eu vou contar uma historinha também usando aí analogias televisivas. Em 1974, nós tivemos uma novela, a soap opera, chamada O Espigão, The Skyscraper. E é uma história muito engraçada, porque a trama da novela é baseada num grupo... toda novela tem um núcleo rico e um núcleo pobre. Então, nessa novela, O Espigão, o núcleo rico, que era os Fontana, não é à toa de Fountainhead, uma lembrança, a Ayn Rand. Então, os Fontana querem comprar uma propriedade em Botafogo e fazer o Fontana Tower, era algo assim, um grande edifício. E, bem, vale a pena botar no YouTube, são ótimas os momentos onde o Fontana mostra o prédio para os sócios, né? Então, o prédio ele era todo envidraçado, com muita tecnologia. Por que eu comecei a contar isso mesmo? Eu me empolguei aqui com a novela. Então, o Espigão é muito curioso. Nesse momento, há também um momento de mudança da legislação urbanística da cidade, também nesse momento, nos anos 70. E o Rio de Janeiro, diferente de outras, ou à frente de outras cidades brasileiras, de uma certa maneira numa situação de vanguarda, os cariocas começaram a publicamente reclamar de edifícios altos. Começaram a surgir na cidade, na paisagem, edifícios de uma escala desproporcional. Nós tivemos nos anos 70 uma legislação urbanística que produzia embasamentos garagem e torres em cima desse embasamento garagem. Então, em alguns momentos, em alguns lugares da cidade, você tinha esse corpo do embasamento que era muito mais alto do que o bairro e em cima desse corpo vinham os edifícios em altura. Então, é muito curioso esse momento duplo, onde você tem uma novela, um produto cultural de massa e, ao mesmo tempo, a população reclamando. Então, é muito interessante a gente observar a evolução da altura dos edifícios no Rio de Janeiro. Então, você tem, durante uma cidade que vai até o final do século XIX com a mesma altura, e no começo do século XX, nos anos 20, a cidade, assim como outras grandes cidades no mundo, começam a fazer os seus arranha-céus, com o edifício à noite na Praça Mauá. Curiosamente, também abrigando uma rádio, né? a espelho de outras. Então, o edifício, o arranha-céu, ele também tem um conteúdo de mídia de massa. Isso é o primeiro movimento, então, de mudança da paisagem da cidade. Então, você tem esse primeiro salto nos anos 20, em transição dos 20 para o 30, é uma mudança na economia brasileira também, o país está saindo da economia do café e entrando na industrialização, essencialmente, para ser bem genérico, e a gente vai ter um outro momento, então, de transição significativa, que é nos anos 70. Então, é um momento de grande crescimento da economia brasileira, é um momento de sofisticação da nossa base industrial e aí também é um momento de transformação contundente das cidades brasileiras. Então, no caso do Rio de Janeiro, curiosamente, no cenário nacional, essa é a minha leitura, tá? Curiosamente, no cenário nacional, há um movimento da sociedade contra esse tipo de cidade. Isso ganha uma base social e política e as próprias legislações começam a ser refeitas e essa curva de crescimento da cidade começa de novo a descer e chega nesse instrumento de preservação de patrimônio. Bem, essa grande história que eu estou contando é porque hoje no Porto, de uma certa maneira, há uma possibilidade de um novo adensamento. E não é à toa, curiosamente, que de novo surgem questionamentos com relação à altura. Nós, lá no Patrimônio Cultural, estamos estudando, passamos quase 2 anos estudando a região do Centro Histórico, identificamos terrenos vazios, aonde entendemos que vale a pena mudar a legislação de patrimônio, de modo a permitir maior adensamento, gravando o uso para o uso habitacional exclusivamente, entendendo que essa nossa paisagem híbrida pode comportar edifícios mais altos sem nenhum grande dano de patrimônio. Bem, essa é uma explanação. A questão que eu queria então trazer para a discussão é a relação entre preservação e revitalização de áreas, ou como acho que mostra muito bem a experiência, acho que a experiência de Nova York, tanto da cidade quanto também a experiência do seu escritório, mostra uma habilidade em fazer gestão de partes da cidade. Então, eu queria trazer esse tema. Como aparece a preservação, como aparecem os contextos históricos nesses ambientes de renovação. De um certo modo, esse espaço que nós estamos é um pouco espelho dessa infraestrutura de oportunidade, como você chamou, né? A estratégia do Estúdio X e do Centro Carioca de Design é de trazer para a Praça Tiradentes uma nova vitalidade. Então, eu queria saber como é que você vê isso e sobre essa influência, então, das teorias de patrimônio francesas, né, no mundo. Não é à toa que a gente vê 2 bienais de Veneza. Anteriormente, o Rencourt fez um excelente apanhado sobre a evolução do campo teórico do patrimônio no planeta e também do crescimento das áreas de preservação cultural no planeta. Hoje, 4% do território urbanizável do planeta Terra é protegido por patrimônio, por áreas da Unesco, por áreas de patrimônio mundial. Curiosamente, o Bloomberg também é o prefeito com maior proteções de patrimônio na história da cidade. Bem, não é bem uma pergunta, isso é um apanhado, porque é um tema que eu acho que é muito importante para a cidade do Rio de Janeiro, que ela possa refletir sobre os valores de patrimônio, sobre as oportunidades de adensar esses contextos históricos. É muito difícil produzir um adensamento de fato na região central se nós não reavaliarmos alguns desses nossos valores. Estamos a 150, 200 metros de um maior terreno vazio da região do centro do Rio, que é um terreno de 5.400 metros quadrados, cuja permissão de altura dada pelo patrimônio é de apenas 10,50 metros. 10,50 metros é uma base, uma possibilidade de construção muito mais baixa do que esse edifício. Então, essa é uma questão que eu queria trazer, não é bem uma pergunta para você, mas eu queria que você pudesse falar, porque eu sei que no livro você fala um pouco sobre isso, e que a gente pudesse aí também discutir.
Let me just quickly comment on that, because I think heritage
the heritage preservation is extraordinarily important because what gives our cities so much of their life and their soul. And I think actually it's interesting. I spent a lot of time in China where these very important pieces of the city's fabric have been torn down, never to come back. And I think there are a lot of Chinese preservationists now who are very aware of this and trying to change the way in which they're doing this. And so I think heritage is very important. Where I think it can go too far, though, and where it goes too far is where it imagines that everything is frozen in time. I think we can all reach consensus about what buildings and neighborhoods are truly of historical quality. And then other than that, I think you should allow buildings to be buildings. And I showed a slide that showed, in fact, heritage sites that actually can sell their floor area in order to recoup value to help preserve the heritage site. That's now part of New York City landmarks law, so one can do that in certain cases. So that's a positive thing about New York. But the negative thing is sometimes what you see is preservation concerns actually being used to stop development. I know one historic district, for instance, that recently passed in New York City, where a big part of the historic district is a parking lot. And this was all an attempt to stop any development from happening on that parking lot. It had nothing to do with the historic relation. And so these things can become abused. And so it's all about finding the right balance. And that's why I showed that slide of London, because I actually think London has done this with great grace and understood how to keep its heritage sites, but at the same time create new development and a lot of quite beautiful new development. And this relates actually back to the point you were making about how the suburbs here are different and not quite, that they're lacking in things. Because I think what we have to remember is the more we control or resist development in cities, the more that demand is going to spread out into other areas where there isn't any access to transit, where infrastructure is much more expensive, and so forth. It creates a whole set of other social problems. And so again, it's this balance of trying to create enough development so that you can keep that demand inside of the city, and also you can then balance it with this social housing. And I think that's critical, not just because it's the right thing to do or the ethical thing to do, but because environmentally and economically, the entire country will be better off if we create these more mixed income districts in cities. And so this is why I think just finding the right balance in these policies is critical.
Bom, primeiro, eu fiquei feliz, porque eu sou muito mais novo que o Washington, falou aqui com uma intimidade tremenda de uma novela de 1974, então realmente assim eu estou impressionado. Mas agora eu queria ouvir um pouco, Vishaan, se você pudesse, pela sua experiência como diretor do curso de Real Estate da Colômbia, que certamente te coloca em contato, uma rede global aí de pensadores, de estudantes, de tomadores de decisão, etc. E também pela sua atuação, uma vez que você estava falando, a gente conversando antes, de uma atuação muito focada em Nova York, mas também com trabalhos expressivos na África, ou seja, acho que deve ser uma diferença muito grande para você. Que tipo de, quer dizer, o Rio, Washington como ativo na prefeitura, poderia falar com muito mais propriedade, mas o Rio tem buscado, com acertos, com erros, com sucesso, com fracasso, algumas alternativas, de pensar como fazer essa nova cidade. Eu queria ouvir de você que experiências você tem, tanto a partir de Nova York, que foi uma cidade que soube realmente se transformar. Eu me lembro quando eu fui lá há muito tempo atrás, não tanto quanto eu gosto de assistir a novela, mas que realmente você não se sentia seguro. Você entrava em certas regiões da cidade, era pequeno, meu pai ali, calma aí, não sei o quê. Já depois, quando eu voltei para fazer o mestrado em 99, 2000, a gente saía 2 da manhã com uma tranquilidade tremenda, né? Logo depois da mudança. Óbvio que também, pagando seu preço de crítica, né? Muita crítica, o Times Square, gentrification, etc. Como lidar com isso, principalmente agora que já passaram 15, 20 anos dessa transformação. Então, que tipo de mecanismos uma cidade como Nova York, né, utilizou e eventualmente aprimorou para gerar as transformações que ela conseguiu fazer acontecer? E que tipo de mecanismos você vê, por exemplo, a África, ou outros lugares onde você tem a oportunidade de ter contato, têm sido utilizados, né, nesse sentido de buscar uma nova maneira de se pensar e fazer a cidade?
Big complex question, and I don't know if I have all the answers. Well, I'll take it in 2 pieces. The transformation of New York from the 70s and the crime, you know, it's interesting. It's controversial what happened to bring crime down, but a lot of it had to do with much more neighborhood policing. The thing that's important to understand about the controversy around crime is that in the 1970s, the neighborhoods that were the biggest victims of crime were the low-income neighborhoods. It wasn't just that wealthy people didn't feel safe. It was actually the murders and all the violent crime were actually happening in the poorest neighborhoods. And so it was through a lot of police work. You know, there was this whole moment where the policemen were coming out of their cars, and there was this whole idea of the broken window policy. So basically, that the police would address small crimes that would happen on the street before they turned into much bigger crimes. That's now transformed into a very controversial debate that we've been having about civil rights in the current mayoral election. And I won't go into all the details on that, but it's a controversial topic. And there's a lot of different theories for why crime went away, not just in New York, but in a lot of major American cities in a very significant way. The second question having to do with Africa and like what one learns from a place like New York. One of the things that I found internationally, I showed that slide of Dubai, is that too much, when we talk about urban redevelopment, people show big pretty pictures of new areas that are going to get developed and so forth. I think like we're designing a new city outside of Nairobi in Kenya. And what we're really trying to do is design it from the infrastructure up. Before we talk about placing a single building, we say, where's the transit system? Where's the sewage going? Where's the water coming from? Where's the power coming from? And just these very basic infrastructural questions, you know, before you get into how are the buildings laid out, how are the buildings designed, how big are the buildings? You know, those are very important questions, but I think they have to follow from where is the infrastructure? And will the infrastructure last? Will it be sustainable? Will it be resilient? Because, I mean, I was born in India and I watched Indian cities grow in crazy ways that have nothing to do with what the infrastructure can support. And Indian cities today are this horrible mess. And some very beautiful cities have been transformed into some very ugly places now. And so I really think that's, and I think that New York is a great city today because 100 years ago, that's the way people thought. They built an amazing subway system. They built one of the most extraordinary water systems of any major city in the world. And we're still living off of those investments and that smart planning that people did 120 years ago now. And so that's, I think, where to begin always is the infrastructure.
Eu só queria esclarecer para o Dói, porque eu sou de 72, eu não vi a novela. Você não precisa ter nascido, porque senão, por exemplo, se eu falar sobre. Falar sobre José de Alencar, então. Olha, eu queria fazer uma pergunta um pouco mais pessoal, porque algo chama a atenção no seu currículo, essa experiência no setor público e no setor privado. Eu queria que você pudesse falar como foi isso Isso pareceu bastante interessante, essas suas duas experiências e em contato com o mercado imobiliário e o primeiro diagrama que você mostra, né? Como é que esses dois lados lidaram com esses 4 quadrantes que você mostra ali no começo?
It happened without any kind of a plan. I think I'm a person who every 5 years tries to do something new for which I have no qualifications whatsoever. And so it's just this idea of, I mean, to me, too much of education is very sliced. Even when I was an undergraduate, I studied art history and engineering. And everyone on both sides, in both departments, tried to fight the dual major. And I don't know what it is about people that we feel like we have to force each other into boxes. So we have to somehow say, you know, this person is X. This person is a designer, and therefore he can't understand real estate. Or, you know, she's a lawyer, so therefore she can't possibly understand art. I just don't think that's the way the world works. And I think that's too much of the way our education works. And so one of the things I really try to do with my students is try to get them to break that thinking. That if someone comes from an investment bank and you put a pen in their hand and say, go draw this. If someone's an architect and you show them that actually designing a pro forma for a real estate project is a piece of design. There's actually a kind of way in which design thinking enters into doing a financial spreadsheet. And so this to me, I think all of our school, GSAP, is headed in this direction, is trying to break down these boundaries. It's very, very difficult because for whatever set of reasons, people are very entrenched in their individual kind of fortresses, and they build strengths in that fortress, and so they don't really want to break down these barriers. And I would say, especially to the younger people in the audience, that I don't know how we're going to solve the problems we have as a planet unless we break down the barriers. The problems we have absolutely demand this cross-disciplinary thinking that I think all of us are responsible for.
Queria saber se algum de vocês tem uma pergunta.
Boa noite, meu nome é Mariana, sou estudante de arquitetura da PUC e eu estou fazendo projeto urbano, por isso que na verdade eu vim para essa palestra. Eu acho que é um assunto muito interessante e realmente o que você falou é importantíssimo e nós estudantes não temos conhecimento disso. Pelo menos eu não tinha até chegar ao 6º período. Que é você realmente ter um pensamento muito mais abrangente e você conseguir pensar fora do caso, né? E a minha pergunta, na verdade, foi só um comentário, uma pergunta seguinte: você mostrou Nova York como exemplo básico e muitas cidades planas, só que aqui no Rio a gente tem uma condição muito diferente, né? A gente tem muita topografia também. Eu queria saber como é que, se você já teve algum exemplo de no seu trabalho, na sua vida profissional.
It's a very great question. It's interesting. I think most dense cities are built densely because they either have topography or they're constrained by water. So Manhattan is Manhattan because it's an island. You know, the exception is a place like Dubai, actually. You know, I was always taught that you build skyscrapers because you run out of land. You can't go horizontally, so you go vertically. Right? But in Dubai, you get to the top of the skyscraper and all you see is land. There's just desert in every direction, or water. So I think some of the constraints that come from a water-based confinement, like an island, are similar to what you find in topography, where all the density ends up in kind of one or two locations. To me, the closest urban form to Rio is Hong Kong. You may not have seen it in that diagram, but what's interesting about Hong Kong is only about 30% of Hong Kong is built upon. The other 60%, 70% is mountainous, and people go hiking in it. Actually, Hong Kong is a city of hikers. And so from that perspective, people don't think of Hong Kong this way, but it's actually a very green city. And I think it's one of the things, I mean, I was noticing that illuminated art piece that on the wall there, that's Lower Manhattan with your topography on it. I mean, it really is very beautiful. The beautiful thing about topography is it lifts the green up into the section of the city. But I think what that demands, though, is that much more concern for density, because when you have that kind of topography, it means that you have serious constraints on where development can occur. And I would bet over time, with sea level rise, it means that there are more vulnerable areas where those valleys meet the water. And that's probably a significant concern, I guess.
Recentemente eu li um livro chamado Untitled Chapter, e diz basicamente bastante similar ao que você disse agora das grandes metrópoles e da questão do êxodo e do entrar em metrópoles. E ele cita até Houston como uma das cidades que mais tem altos padrões de vida pelos menores custos, e sendo uma das cidades onde emitem mais carbono das áreas residenciais, né, das grandes casas e automóveis, e é responsável pelo grande êxodo das grandes cidades, onde hoje em dia a gente vê um sentido inverso ao que acontecia antigamente. Né? Muitas pessoas saindo das grandes cidades e indo para cidades suburbanas, procurando melhor qualidade de ensino para os filhos, menor custo de vida, melhor qualidade de vida, mais conforto. E isso, teoricamente, não é um bom sinal para as grandes cidades. E queria saber como você trabalhou em setores públicos e privados, o que você acha de existe um dado momento onde as grandes cidades se encontram numa situação onde elas caminham para um fluxo positivo? Eu digo, sou grande cidade como Hong Kong e Nova York, e hoje Nova York tem um período de colhe frutos de uma boa política de médio e longo prazo. E para que isso, imagino que para que isso tenha sido viável, ela também passou por grandes períodos de crise e por grandes problemas que geraram questionamentos e levaram a essas soluções que estão sendo dadas hoje. E claramente isso é fruto de políticas de continuidade, né, de gestão política, até nos 4 setores que você mostrou no começo, do legal, do design e da economia. Isso tudo trabalhando de maneira consensual. E hoje a gente vê um momento de grandes mudanças na nossa cidade aqui, e fica muito questionamento no ar de que soluções técnicas de planejamento urbano e setorização vão sempre ser achadas, independente da região e da época. Mas a pergunta é em que momento isso acontece, né? Os grandes acontecimentos que a gente está vivendo aqui no Rio de Janeiro hoje podem ser de muito sucesso, como podem ser catastróficos no nosso futuro. E nós aqui, como arquitetos, sabemos disso. Muitas coisas são feitas com bom planejamento, outras são feitas de maneira atropelada, de maneira obscura e de maneira que a gente não sabe muito aonde vai dar. Então, você, como tem participado em diferentes setores, o que você acha disso? Cidades precisam necessariamente passar por momentos de crise, enfrentar grandes dificuldades para despertar e esses setores se dialogarem e chegarem a um momento correto, ou é viável de que elas consigam, de maneira voluntária, reverter um quadro É só isso mesmo. Você acha que em que momento as cidades podem chegar nesse ponto onde Hong Kong ou Nova York chegaram de colher frutos de um bom projeto, um bom planejamento?
think I understood the question, and my first response would be that it is up to you. And by that I mean all of you, particularly who are younger. I think you have to demand the best possible planning in your cities. I have 90 students a year, 45 of whom come from all over the world, and so they're all interacting with each other. And I think they're all starting to influence each other. And I have great hope for, not just my students, but students that I see in universities all over the place who are going out and trying to figure this out. And I think that you as a generation have the most potential to create this change. I don't think that means, by the way, that every place has to be Hong Kong or New York. Part of why I showed the Japanese farming village is there are examples, small and large, of all of this. It's not everyone having to live in a big, tall building. There are many, many ways to do this that still constitutes, I think, sound planning. I also think some things will happen as a natural consequence of things like there will be some point at which energy prices will really rise, and it will be less and less economical for people to drive places. The one last thing I would just say is, the United States has many problems, but I think one of the areas in which it's succeeding is, we do have a country, and New York is a city where, people who aren't very wealthy and people who are quite wealthy live in the same building. They take the same mass transit to work. And this is a fairly common phenomenon, right? The mayor of New York City, who's the 10th richest man in the world, I think, takes the subway to City Hall. He's very proud that he uses the metro. And I think this is one of the changes that needs to really start occurring in different places. I gave a similar lecture in Bogota, Colombia, and the simultaneous translation stopped when I showed the slide about people living in the same building, because they were sure that I was saying something was getting lost in the translation. They couldn't believe that this was a possibility. And so I think this is a big, and this is true in India as well. It would be a big challenge to get wealthy people and lower income people to live in the same building. But to me, it's a very important thing to try to do, even if it can't be accomplished in a building, in a neighborhood, right? To start creating social mobility and class change and so forth that's tied to the environment and the economy. So. But again, I think all of this begins and ends with your generation. I think you're either going to do it right, or we're going to have a lot of problems moving forward after you.
Eu acho que a gente tem mais uma outra pergunta da Rafaela e depois a gente encerra. Boa noite. A pergunta, na verdade, para os três, eu queria uma pergunta mais direcionada ao Washington e ao Pedro. Mas que diz respeito a uma observação minha sobre a sua fala, sobre a fala de diversos profissionais estrangeiros que tiveram aqui no X, enfim, quando holandeses vieram, eles colocaram esse mesmo ponto que você acabou de colocar, da importância da mistura social, nas áreas urbanas, enfim, preferencialmente nos edifícios, mas nos quarteirões, nas quadras, etc. E esse eu acho um ponto fundamental que você colocou na sua fala em diversos momentos para a qualidade na cidade, né? Essa possibilidade de oferecimento de oportunidade, acho que está diretamente relacionado com isso. E eu acho que é um desafio imenso cultural que nós temos aqui no país, e especialmente no Rio de Janeiro. E a minha pergunta, acho que meu questionamento vem exatamente com isso que você está colocando, como isso tem a ver com vocês devem demandar essa mudança, e pegando o gancho do que está acontecendo hoje por exemplo, o Porto do Rio, quer dizer, existe um projeto residencial imenso, né, sendo desenvolvido, gostaria que tivessem outros, existem poucos projetos residenciais acontecendo ali, até onde se sabe, e não há, por exemplo, esse tipo de preocupação, ou, quer dizer, vou colocar de outra maneira, não há, não transparece essa orientação ou essa colocação, essa imposição que seja do poder público em relação ao mercado imobiliário. Então, a pergunta que eu direcionaria a você, pela sua experiência com o mercado imobiliário e tal, é de que forma isso acontece nos lugares onde você atuou, e por outro lado aos outros, assim, se vocês veem isso como um horizonte possível, que isso passe a acontecer. E isso está muito relacionado, inclusive é uma questão que foi colocada muito pertinentemente pelo Pablo Benetti aqui nos Tutis, em relação à importância da gestão da terra em qualquer possibilidade de mudança de cenário social nas cidades, e a gestão da terra como sendo uma posição mais efetiva do poder público em relação ao interesse da cidade, em contraponto ao interesse imobiliário, né? E isso acho que é uma questão muito complicada que ninguém aqui consegue ver no horizonte. Então, enfim, queria lançar isso aí ao debate.
So I just want to say, it's interesting, in terms of political power, the projects that I showed you, there's actually 3 that I can think of very quickly. The one I showed you, and then 2 others, very large projects, where they would not get city council approval if they did not have these levels of social housing in the project. The city council simply would not approve it. And the developer would lose so much money if they didn't get the development done. For them, it makes sense to go and do that. And there are tax credits, and there's a removal of a certain amount of market risk. There are advantages to the developer doing that. But ultimately, it's political. You can't get the approvals without it.
Queria, antes de te responder, fazer uma pergunta, porque eu acho que de fato a sua pergunta é muito importante. O que ele mostra, e a gente sabe dessas experiências internacionais, é um ponto realmente de curiosidade, de atenção. Então, a pergunta é: desses projetos que você mostrou, que tem esse mix de housing, a gente falou aqui brincando, né? Assim, como é que é o elevador? As pessoas pegam mesmo o elevador. E você acabou de dizer que tem uma definição, um parâmetro, eles não seriam aprovados se não tivessem isso. Eu queria perguntar quanto tempo tem essa prática, já é uma prática consolidada, e o próprio mercado imobiliário já se adequou a essa prática, ou é algo novo, e internamente as dinâmicas sociais dentro do prédio, como é que funciona?
It's been a practice since, well, it started in 1986 with the tax reform of 1986. It actually started because of tax credits and the way developers were incentivized to build buildings. I used to work for a major development company where we built some of these, and we never had any problems with it. The law, once you build these, in order to get the tax credits, you have to comply with certain standards. So it's the same building entrance, it's the same lifts. You can't put all the low-income units in one part of the building that has the worst views or is in darkness. They have to be spread across the building. The basic experience with them has been that most of the luxury renters don't even know that the lower-income people are there. And there are interesting sociological studies that have been done in these buildings that the low-income behavior changes very quickly. I want to be careful because I don't want to sound like a social determinist, but there have been, for instance, the things that people might be concerned about: crime, vandalism. So there's been almost no instances of that in these buildings. That the media I think what happens is the environment immediately says, this is a place of quality, this is a place that's our home, and we need to be as good to it as everyone else in the building is being good to it. And I think it transforms social lifestyle very quickly, particularly for the children who are of the mixed income family. I think it's a dramatic impact.
Acho que esse tema é essencial, de novo, com aquela questão que eu falei no começo, da reinventar a cidade que a gente quer. O que é engraçado é que na prática, se a gente pega os edifícios existentes, muitas vezes existe. Aqui perto tem o famoso Avenida Central, lá de moradia, de trabalho. Talvez nos seus edifícios, nos seus andares superiores, tem a sede de uma das maiores empresas do Brasil, com vaga de elevador é um luxo só. Se você desce 3, 4 andares, é lotado de salas de prostíbulos, etc. De elevador subindo. E lá embaixo, aquelas lojas de informática, onde você compra as peças mais baratas. Então, você vê, no mesmo edifício, você tem essa vitalidade. Ao mesmo tempo, quando a gente vai falar com um empreendedor, né? Não, de jeito nenhum, do corpo, né? Onde você fala. Nossa ideia inicial era ter de apartamento de 1 quarto a 4 quartos. Virou 2, 3 quartos. Tamanhos diferenciados, 2, 3 quartos. Como que uma pessoa que compra um 4 quartos vai morar junto com uma que compra um quarto, que compra um quarto é um jovem, o outro já vai ter uma família formada. Quer dizer, na cabeça do empreendedor essa diversidade não pode acontecer, né? E que a gente indiretamente mal bem vive. A gente mora em Ipanema, está em Cantagalo, a gente mora em Pacatuba, mora em São Paulo, segregado, de certa maneira, estou dividindo o mesmo espaço, na mesma rua. Então é um tema que é interessante ver que em Nova York tem imposto, né? Na Inglaterra, quando eu sinto ali, tem imposto. E a partir dessa imposição, se deixar na mão do empreendedor privado, obviamente ele não vai fazer. Então realmente deve ser um movimento, né? Mas acho que cabe, como ele disse, né? Cabe a nós também entender, porque a gente já vive numa situação dessa. São discussões às vezes banais no meu prédio. Eu moro num prédio pequeno, no belo dia teve aquela famosa discussão, vamos botar grade. Né? Os prédios que foram assaltados na Lagoa, eu tinha grade, eu vou botar grade. Então são às vezes decisões que está todo mundo fazendo, vamos fazer igual, não vai dar certo, aquela coisa que olhamos, o medo é diferente, não, nenhum lugar tem isso, se eu fizer não vai funcionar. E a gente ter coragem também de pensar, né, como eu disse, um pouco fora da caixa, acreditar nessas coisas, acreditar nas experiências que a gente vê acontecer. Mas também, óbvio, né, às vezes uma decisão, mas que vem de cima e fala, ou é ou não é. E aí as coisas vão funcionar. Mas acho que o caminho natural e a tendência é essa.
A sua pergunta é de fato muito importante, é importante para esse momento da cidade, é importante nesse momento que a gente fala de grandes eventos, a cidade deseja ter um posicionamento internacional, global. Eu acho que esse é um tema fundamental. Eu queria então te dar uma resposta olhando para essa minha experiência aí de 5 anos, né, dentro da prefeitura. Eu vejo da seguinte maneira, eu acho que infelizmente nós somos muito pendulares nessas discussões. A gente tem uma certa dificuldade do ponto de vista do planejador urbano público dentro da prefeitura e com o mercado imobiliário de conseguir estabelecer caminhos comuns que atingem objetivos, o famoso ganha-ganha, esse clichê. Então, eu vejo o seguinte, o planejador urbano não consegue fazer conta, não consegue entender os mecanismos que levam à produção dos edifícios. Te digo por essa experiência de patrimônio, a gente olha aqui essa paisagem, a gente vê edifícios muito mais altos, a gente vê assim, né, como é interessante isso. E seria muito bom nós pudéssemos ter alguns edifícios mais altos nesse contexto aqui, eu defendo isso, de modo que a gente possa ter um adensamento dessa área
mas se a gente for imaginar essa região aqui do corredor cultural, toda ela densa de gente, é uma densidade de terra mais 3, é muito pouco. Não é à toa que essa área é só de uso comercial, sábado fecha, domingo fecha. Acho que era muito importante a gente pegar o case e cores da Lapa, por exemplo, olha o impacto positivo que teve em toda aquela região. Isso sem ter sido uma mudança de legislação. Simplesmente era uma estrutura industrial que estava ali esquecida, foi recuperada, 789 unidades vendidas em 2 horas, e hoje você tem você tem um ecossistema de serviços e comércios em função daquele adensamento populacional. A gente precisa ter mais cores da Lapa no corredor cultural. Entretanto, quando esse tipo de discussão, Rafael, a gente tem sempre do outro lado para assim, isso é impossível, porque isso é uma degradação do nosso patrimônio, da cidade, e parece sempre uma que a gente está de fato ainda olhando para esse nosso passado aí, de Belle Époque, de Paris tropical. Essa paisagem híbrida é muito mais interessante do que essa monotonia. Salzburgo está mudando para poder ter lá uma paisagem mais dinâmica. Então acho que a gente tem esse ambiente. Do outro lado, o promotor imobiliário, ele visa algo que é muito claro que é o lucro. Então ele tem que ser de fato regulado. Então eu acho que a gente acaba que a cidade perde nessas duas, nessa incapacidade de atingir objetivos comuns que são bons para a cidade como um todo. Hoje foi o lançamento a entrega para foi o lançamento para os servidores da prefeitura do Porto Vida, lá no projeto do Dóicaro, projeto que ganhou o concurso público de arquitetura. Como ele disse aqui, o julgamento do júri, uma quadra aberta, isso os primeiros pontos que a gente falou na época, depois ele falou também, se perdeu nesse desenvolvimento junto ao mercado. E aí você tem uma atuação do ponto de vista do regulador que é fraca na medida que ela não consegue se colocar no lugar do promotor imobiliário e não conseguir criar mecanismos que tornem aquela mesma viabilidade interessante, mas resgatando aspectos públicos. Eu estou falando aqui bem francamente porque é um pouco as discussões que eu vejo acontecer. Existe um ambiente de muito debate dentro da prefeitura sobre esses pontos. Se existe um lado positivo, de fato essas não duas correntes, ou várias correntes coexistem. Então hoje teve esse lançamento lá no Porto Vida, que perdeu aí um pouco da sua característica inicial, entretanto ele traz um impacto muito positivo de perspectiva de avançamento para a área. E hoje também foi um anúncio de um projeto de lei para incentivo habitacional na região do Porto. O objetivo dessa legislação é corrigir, fazer uma mudança de curso no projeto do Porto. Um projeto que tem uma base de caráter estratégico, não uma base de projeto desenhado. O Porto nunca teve, não tem até hoje uma forma urbana definida, a gente não tem um master plan onde a gente possa avaliar essa correlação de massa construída, espaços livres, fluxos. E eu te digo que essa é uma decisão, pode parecer, mas é uma decisão acertada do ponto de vista de pragmatismo de decisão pública com o objetivo de que a coisa aconteça. Porque, por outro lado, nós temos também experiências enormes, em quantidade de experiências mal sucedidas. A própria região do Teleporto, onde está o prédio da prefeitura. É um projeto, a última experiência recente, anos 80, não mal sucedida. Avenida Chile, vamos recuar um pouquinho mais no tempo. A Avenida Chile, só está sendo completa agora, vamos voltar um pouquinho mais no tempo. Presidente Vargas, 1945, ainda vazia. Então, nós temos esse histórico de projetos e de tentativas não realizadas. Então, eu acho que, fazendo aqui uma comparativa, uma metáfora grosseira, machista, acho que é um pouco assim, de se procurar esse desejo de cidade, você não consegue realizar, então você acaba funcionando com uma atuação, essa cidade desejada, como ela nunca acontece, você acaba um pouco sendo pragmático, e isso acaba produzindo projetos que a gente olha para o ambiente internacional, projetos que eu acho que de fato estão aquém. Não é de modo algum caso do Porto Vida, mas em termos de planejamento maior. Então esse projeto de lei hoje, ele tem esse objetivo de corrigir essa mudança, de fazer uma pequena inflexão no projeto, um projeto que tem na sua origem, na sua raiz, um projeto estratégico. O projeto estratégico, ele é um projeto pragmático, um projeto olhando para a realidade do mercado, no contexto de 2009, pós-crise financeira de 2008, esse projeto tem que dar certo, porque esse projeto e a gente sabe que projetos para a região portuária datam de 1979, sucessivos, diversos, não concluídos. A própria cidade do Samba era um bairro habitacional que virou cidade do Samba. Então, a gente tem esse nosso histórico. Então, a gente toma decisões, eu entendo que a prefeitura, falando então como órgão geral, não falando nas suas lideranças, mas como organismo corporativo, ela toma decisões olhando para esse seu tracking record. Então, olha, eu tenho essas experiências e eu tomo essa decisão. Então, esse projeto de lei faz uma mudança, ele dá incentivos, um incentivo que é ouro, né, no mercado imobiliário, que é a exclusão das circulações horizontais e verticais da ATE dos empreendimentos. Então, quem fizer residencial poderá se beneficiar disso. A gente sabe que é um bom estímulo para o mercado imobiliário. Então, há um cenário positivo em termos de produção residencial. Entretanto, produção residencial num extrato social de classe média. Não teremos no Porto, mesmo numa perspectiva de longo prazo, nunca vai ser um bairro de fato de classe alta. Não temos esse. Aí sim, se tivéssemos esse potencial, eu vejo como risco. Então, acho que tem uma capacidade de acomodação dessa produção de classe média que é muito interessante para a região central como um todo. E, ao mesmo tempo, foi também anunciada uma produção de 2.000 unidades de habitação de interesse social, feitas diretamente pelo município. Você tem, por um lado, 2.000 unidades de habitação de interesse social sendo anunciadas, o lançamento de um empreendimento de caráter de classe média, padrão ali é São Cristóvão, de uma certa maneira, né? A gente está falando de classe média, 1.300 unidades, e com essa mudança da legislação, a possibilidade de incremento dessa produção. Olhando em sabedor dessas experiências, isso é um projeto de lei que vai para a Câmara dos Vereadores. Então, eu estou contando isso tudo. É um processo democrático, tem um ambiente de possibilidade de discussão. Eu acho que é importante que essa discussão aconteça. Eu, participando da elaboração desse projeto de lei, por exemplo, tentei colocar lá gradientes de unidade de habitação de interesse social dentro dos empreendimentos, olhando para essas experiências internacionais. E se não quisesse produzir dentro da unidade, a obrigação de produzir fora em maior quantidade. Tá? Então, propus lá 20% de habitação de interesse social dentro do empreendimento. Acho que é uma proposta conservadora, mas olhando para a nossa realidade cultural, 20% de unidade de habitação de interesse social dentro do empreendimento, e se fosse fora, teria que fazer 40%. Fora do empreendimento, olhando para esse nosso ambiente cultural. Se a gente pegar, por exemplo, a experiência de São Paulo, Casa Paulista, como é que é? Os estratos sociais são separados em torres. Então você tem no Casa Paulista a habitação de mercado sendo feita, numa torre, na torre do lado é a outra faixa social, que é também um outro modo de manejar essas tensões culturais. Então, eu assim, fui voto vencido, fiquei entendendo que isso, de fato, a gente precisa ter uma proposta que seja pragmática, que possa, de fato, acontecer. Eu te digo com muita convicção que esse pragmatismo é muito positivo, tá, Rafael? Porque é positivo porque, de fato, a gente tem um cenário muito mais interessante na região do Porto hoje, olhando para todo esse passivo de não realização. E existe um ambiente aí possível de discussão democrática na medida que isso é um projeto de lei que vai para a Câmara dos Vereadores. Essa é uma discussão muito importante. Essa é uma discussão importante, portanto, eu acho que a gente tem que saber conduzi-la de modo de fato, em acordo, em harmônico com as nossas experiências pregressas e culturais. Essas discussões, quando elas radicalizam, elas levam movimentos de reação contrária também radicais e perde todo mundo nessa discussão. Então, desculpa, a resposta foi longa, mas estou aqui de fato aqui sendo franco e olhando para o ambiente de tomada de decisão, como essas decisões são tomadas. Eu te digo, essas decisões são tomadas com muita discussão, olhando diversas experiências e práticas, mas no fundo existe um crivo, que é um crivo pragmático e realista. E é bom que políticas públicas tenham um crivo realista. Acho que a gente está um pouco cansado de políticas que não, ou de leis que não funcionam, ou de experiências que não se realizam. Então isso vai para a Câmara dos Vereadores e é um momento dessa discussão acontecer. Que aconteça de uma maneira técnica não é uma boa palavra, mas de uma maneira, do modo baseado na razão e olhando de fato a necessidade de que que a cidade possa ter um desenvolvimento mais harmônico nessa região. Por outro lado, conseguir colocar lá e pedir para grades, então vai ter grades e algumas discussões de vagas também que a gente conseguiu colocar lá, olha, de modo a flexibilizar. Mas essa discussão tem que ter a função fundamental, eu fui voto vencido, e é normal, é uma discussão democrática, técnica, aberta. Mas é um projeto de lei que é muito bom, que traz um bom panorama para a região do Porto. Há também uma afirmação da Prefeitura com essa produção de habitação de interesse social, como eu disse, 2.000 unidades, é importante, mas essa discussão do compromisso do próprio mercado com essa produção de habitação acessível é um compromisso importante. E aí eu concluo aqui essa longa resposta e não sei, Pedro, eu queria dizer que o livro é ótimo, te felicitar. E eu acho que essa riqueza das suas experiências pessoais ficam bem claras no livro e a leitura é muito agradável, tem muitas figuras o assunto que eu mais domino é de fato a televisão e eu senti falta só da série Girls, que era Seinfeld, Friends e The Girls, que é a geração Y que não consegue ganhar dinheiro, não consegue pagar aluguel, mas namora loucamente. Então senti só falta de Girls no livro.
Girls, oh, that's true. It's true. I watched it.
Gostaria de agradecer, só colocar um pouco, o Washington falou da habitação de luxo do Porto, Lembro quando a gente terminou o concurso, ligava, nossa, só vai botar habitação de luxo, não, vocês estão equivocados, mas eu adoraria ver no Porto. Apartamentos a R$2.000, apartamentos a R$7.000, apartamentos a R$15.000. Eu acho que é isso que Copacabana é isso. Agora você tem R$20.000 na praia, você no quarteirão, você tem, sei lá, os preços hoje do Rio a gente não sabe onde é que estão. E eu acho que é isso que faz a diversidade. Tomara que a gente tenha, sim, a torre lá bonita, a 15 mil, tomara que a gente tenha também uma série de apartamentos sociais de qualidade, não aquele cantinho escondido, mas um apartamento de qualidade, e que a gente consiga ter então exatamente essa produção. Eu me lembro uma vez, só um parênteses antes de terminar, eu tive uma aluna que era moradora da Barra, aqui onde tem os gated communities, E ela foi minha aluna lá e ela falou o seguinte, ela falou, primeira vez que eu fui a Copacabana, eu tinha, sei lá, 12, 13 anos de idade, eu fui visitar minha avó. Eu falei, não me visitou a avó, Aí, e é uma ótima aluna. Aí, a primeira vez que eu fui a Copacabana, que eu desci na rua, que eu andei na rua de Copacabana, eu fiquei com medo, porque as pessoas esbarravam em mim. Ela falou, com 12 anos de idade, as pessoas esbarravam em mim. Eu falei, o que é isso? Eu estava acostumada a sua velha. Tomara que a gente consiga ter lá essa cidade, que as pessoas se esbarram, porque acho que é aí que sai a vitalidade da cidade.
Bom, você quer falar alguma coisa? Bom,
I'm done. Thank you very much.
Obrigado a todos.